It all started when I, Jake, and my two best friends, Tom and Sarah, decided to go on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere. We had been planning this for months, and the excitement was building up. The place we chose was a secluded forest in the Appalachian Mountains, far away from any towns or roads. There were no cell service signals, which added to the thrill of it all. We wanted to experience the wild, untouched by civilization. We arrived just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in orange and purple hues. The atmosphere felt perfect, quiet, peaceful, with nothing but the sound of birds and the wind rustling through the trees. We set up camp quickly, pitched our tent, started a fire, and cooked some food. The night was cool, but comfortable, and we all laughed, telling stories and enjoying each other's company. But something felt off. Not in an obvious way, but there was an unsettling energy in the air. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement in the woods surrounding us, just beyond the fire's reach. It felt like eyes were watching us, but whenever I looked, there was nothing. I brushed it off as just nerves, the typical paranoia that comes with being out in the wilderness. Around midnight, we settled into the tent to sleep. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway and creak. It was peaceful at first, until I heard it. A distant sound, a low thud, almost like something heavy hitting the ground. I opened my eyes, straining to listen, but there was nothing more. Sarah and Tom were already asleep, so I didn't want to wake them up for something that could easily be explained away by an animal or the wind. But as I lay there, trying to ignore it, the sound came again. Louder this time. Thud. Thud. It was coming closer. I froze, not daring to move or breathe. My heart was racing in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I wanted to reach for my phone, to check if there was anything out there, but I couldn't move. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. I decided to wake Tom up. He's the type of guy who would laugh it off, but at least I wouldn't be alone. I shook him gently. Tom. Tom, wake up. He groggily stirred, his eyes fluttering open. What's going on? He mumbled. I think something's out there, I whispered. His expression turned serious. What do you mean? I heard something, heavy. Coming closer. I was barely above a whisper now, my voice trembling. Tom sat up and glanced toward the flap of the tent, his eyes scanning the dark outline of the forest. Maybe it's an animal, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. We both lay back down, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. It wasn't long before I heard it again, but this time, it was closer, much closer. And then, a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural whisper, almost like a voice, but distorted, like it wasn't meant for human ears. Get out. My blood ran cold. That wasn't the wind. That wasn't an animal. Something, or someone, was out there. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Tom seemed to sense it too. He was sitting up now, fully awake, staring into the darkness with wide, fearful eyes. I'm not going out there, I said, my voice barely audible. Neither of us moved, too scared to make a sound. But it was then that I heard something else. Something much worse. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves just outside our tent. Whoever was out there knew we were inside. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Tom whispered urgently, we need to go. Now. We didn't wait. We grabbed our stuff as quietly as we could, not daring to make any noise. The footsteps were still there, circling the tent, getting closer. And that's when I realized, whoever, or whatever, was out there was watching us, waiting for us to make a move. The moment we unzipped the tent, we heard a sound that will haunt me forever. A voice, so clear, it almost felt like it was inside my head. Run. We didn't need to be told twice. Tom, Sarah, and I ran like our lives depended on it, which, in that moment, I truly believed they did. The sound of our pounding footsteps was drowned out by the footsteps that followed us, always just behind us, never slowing down. We didn't stop running until we were miles away, breathless, terrified, and shaking with fear. As we sat there, catching our breath, I realized something even worse. There were no other campers. No other hikers. Just us. And whatever had followed us. And it was still out there, waiting. I don't know what it was, but I do know one thing for sure, it wasn't human. We sat in the dense trees, our chests heaving with the effort of our run. The night felt thicker now, the darkness more suffocating. Tom, Sarah, and I huddled together, trying to catch our breath, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the eerie stillness around us. Not a single animal was making noise anymore. The usual sounds of the forest had disappeared, and in their place was the unsettling silence. I turned to Tom. "What the hell was that? Did you hear it too?" Tom's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He nodded, his lips trembling. I've never heard anything like it. I swear, it felt like the voice came from inside my head, not from anywhere outside. Sarah was looking around frantically, her eyes darting from tree to tree. "We can't just stay here. We need to find some shelter." But deep down, I knew there was no shelter. Whatever was out there, whatever was following us, wasn't going to let us hide. It wasn't human. That voice, it felt like it came from somewhere darker, something older than anything we could comprehend. Suddenly, I heard it. A faint crack of a twig, followed by the sound of something moving, slow, deliberate, like it was trying to be stealthy, but wasn't very good at it. It was close. Too close. My heart pounded harder in my chest as I instinctively reached for my flashlight, flicking it on and scanning the area around us. Nothing. Just the trees. The shadows. But the feeling in my gut told me something was there. Something was watching. "Guys, we need to move. Now," I whispered urgently, my voice shaking. Tom didn't argue. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her to her feet. As we began to move cautiously through the trees, trying to stay as quiet as possible, the air grew colder, the forest seemingly closing in around us. Every few seconds, I'd hear that same thudding noise again, just faint enough to make us doubt if we really heard it or not. But with each thud, I felt it, like something was closing the gap between us, step by step. And then, in the distance, I saw something. A flicker of movement. Something large, something that didn't belong in the trees. I froze. I felt my breath catch in my throat, and I turned to Tom and Sarah, signaling for them to stop. My heart was racing. We all stood there, completely still, trying not to make a sound, watching the shadows move. A tall figure emerged from the woods, its silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. It was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall. Its limbs seemed stretched, unnaturally long, with fingers that looked like they were made of twisted bone. I could see its face, or what was left of it, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. There was no expression, no movement, just an empty gaze that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It was watching us. Tom's grip tightened on Sarah's arm. "Jake, what the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. But whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't alone. From the corner of my eye, I saw more figures, 3, 4, emerging from the shadows. They were all tall, gaunt, and as featureless as the first one, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, as if they were toying with us, savoring our terror. "Run," I hissed, my voice trembling. Without waiting for a response, I turned and bolted into the trees, pushing past the underbrush, praying I wouldn't trip. Behind me, I could hear Sarah and Tom's hurried footsteps as they followed. But the sound of the creatures behind us didn't stop. They weren't running. They didn't need to. They were moving faster, silently, but with an uncanny precision, closing the distance. The thudding sound grew louder, and I could hear their breath now, raspy and shallow, like it was hard for them to breathe. But they were gaining on us. My mind raced, trying to think of a plan. We needed to get back to the road, find civilization. But the more we ran, the deeper we seemed to go into the woods. The trees were closing in, the path narrowing until there was no clear way forward. It felt like we were running in circles, as if the forest itself was disorienting us, trapping us in some kind of endless loop. And then, I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance. The glow of a lantern. My heart surged with hope. I wasn't imagining it. There were other people, campers, maybe. But as I ran toward the light, I realized something was terribly wrong. The lantern was swaying, moving erratically, like it was being carried by someone who was stumbling. But there was no sound. No footsteps. Just the light, moving on its own, swaying in the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the light. It wasn't a person. It was one of the things. One of them, carrying the lantern, its face still empty and hollow, its eyes locked on me. And then, the voice came again, low and guttural, like it was right behind me. Turn around. I didn't need to be told twice. My feet moved faster than I ever thought possible, my mind screaming at me to escape, to survive. But no matter how fast I ran, the sound of footsteps was always just behind me, always following, getting closer. There was no escaping them. I don't remember how much time passed as we ran, but it felt like hours. Every twist and turn we took seemed to lead us deeper into the forest, further from any hope of safety. The only thing I could focus on was the sound of those footsteps, slow, deliberate, always just behind us. Sometimes I thought I could hear whispering, but it wasn't in any language I knew. It was like the air itself was speaking to me, curling into my ears, full of ancient promises and threats. I don't know how we managed to stay on our feet. We were all exhausted, our legs trembling, our breath ragged. Tom's voice broke through the night, desperate and filled with panic. We're not going to make it. We're gonna die out here. His words were frantic, but I didn't have the heart to argue. I could feel the truth of what he was saying deep in my bones. We were cornered. There was no way out. But then, just as I thought we had reached the point of no return, I saw it. The faint glow of something ahead, this time, it wasn't the swaying light of the creatures. It was a real light. A campfire. Do you see that? Sarah gasped, her voice shaking with exhaustion and hope. We all stopped dead, our eyes locking on the fire. The flickering warmth in the distance was like a beacon of salvation, but deep down, something in my gut told me it wasn't going to be as simple as walking toward it. I knew better now. The forest had already played tricks on us. But we had no choice. We had to try. With renewed desperation, we made our way toward the light, moving as quickly as we could without tripping. The whispering behind us grew louder, more insistent. It felt like it was getting closer, like whatever was following us was closing in for the kill. But the fire kept drawing us in. It had to be real. It had to be. When we finally broke through the trees and reached the clearing where the fire was, I froze. The fire was burning low, but there were no people around it. There was no sign of life. The camp was eerily quiet, as if it had been abandoned long ago. My heart sank. The thing that made it worse wasn't the absence of people, it was what lay beside the fire. A pile of bloodied clothes. Torn and shredded, like someone had been attacked. There were no bodies, just the remains of what had once been a camp. A backpack sat abandoned next to the fire, its zipper halfway open as if someone had been in a hurry to leave. What is this? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Tom stepped forward, his eyes scanning the scene. I don't like this. This place, it feels wrong. I nodded, feeling a wave of nausea hit me. I didn't know what had happened here, but I knew it wasn't good. The fire was still burning, but there was something off about it. The flames danced wildly, flickering unnaturally in the windless air. The warmth from it felt like it was coming from somewhere else, somewhere not of this world. Then, a soft creak sounded from behind us. We all froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was one of them. One of the creatures. Its hollow eyes locked onto us as it slowly stepped forward, its long fingers twitching. It wasn't alone. Another figure stepped out from the darkness behind it, then another, and another. They had been waiting for us. One of them opened its mouth, but instead of a voice, a low growl emerged, a sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a language. It wasn't even a sound I could describe. It was as if the air itself had become thick with something ancient, something predatory. We didn't want to do this, I whispered, more to myself than anyone else. We just wanted to get out. We didn't mean to disturb. The figure took another step forward, and suddenly, the others began to move. They advanced toward us, their long limbs bending unnaturally as they stalked closer. It was as if they were playing with us, letting us realize our fate before it came crashing down. Then, in an instant, the one who had spoken, or who had growled, rather, lunged at us. The air around us exploded with a rush of wind and the sound of something enormous tearing through the trees. It was too fast. Too fast for us to react. The creature's bony fingers wrapped around Tom's arm, and in one brutal motion, it dragged him toward the shadows. I heard Tom scream. A sound that still haunts my nightmares. A scream that was cut off abruptly as the shadows swallowed him whole. I don't remember what happened next. There was no time to think, no time to process. My instincts took over. I grabbed Sarah's wrist and yanked her into the trees, pulling her with me as I ran for our lives. Behind us, I could hear the creature's footsteps, relentless, following us no matter how fast we ran. The whispers were now deafening, filling my head with an overwhelming sense of dread. But then, the ground beneath us shifted. The trees around us started to change, the trunks twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. It felt like we were no longer running through a forest, but through a place that existed outside of time, a place where the rules of nature no longer applied. I could barely make out Sarah's frantic breathing beside me. Jake. Jake, what's happening? I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't even know what was happening. But whatever it wasn't just a chase anymore. We weren't just running from monsters. We were running from something that wanted to claim us. Something that wasn't content to just kill us. It wanted our souls. It wanted to drag us into its darkness and make us part of whatever it was. And I could feel it getting closer. We ran blindly through the twisted forest, not even sure if we were going in the right direction anymore. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but the feeling of something closing in, of the air itself pressing against us, pushed me to keep moving. My breath was ragged, each inhalation a painful rasp in the cold, damp night. Sarah was stumbling beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears. We didn't speak, there was no need. We were both too scared to say anything, too terrified to face the reality of what was happening. The forest around us had shifted. The trees, once towering and familiar, had become grotesque, bent at unnatural angles. Some of them seemed to sway despite the absence of wind, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, grasping at the air. The shadows in the distance felt alive, creeping toward us with purpose, and I knew they were closing in. We were being herded, trapped in a maze of our own making. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out for help, but the fear that gnawed at me stifled every word. I felt the pressure of the darkness pushing down on my chest, a weight that grew heavier with every second. It wasn't just the creatures that pursued us now. It was the forest itself. I stopped suddenly, my feet locking in place. I felt it, a tug in the air, a shift that sent a chill down my spine. "We're not alone," I whispered. Sarah's eyes widened, and she glanced around frantically. "What do you mean?" Before I could answer, I heard it. A deep, guttural growl, like the earth itself was vibrating with malice. It wasn't just one creature this time. It was many. I could feel them, watching us from every direction, their presence almost suffocating. I turned to Sarah, my voice shaking. "They're here. They're all around us." Without waiting for her response, I grabbed her arm and pulled her towards a cluster of trees, desperately searching for any sign of a path, any sign of an escape. But it was hopeless. The forest was closing in, twisting itself tighter around us. The shadows deepened, and the trees seemed to shift, moving in unnatural patterns. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing just ahead, barely visible in the dark. Its outline was tall and twisted, like the others, but this one was different. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It was like a statue, a stillness that chilled me to my core. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't just one of the creatures, it was something worse. The figure stepped forward, its limbs creaking like ancient wood. The sound of its movement was slow, deliberate, and horrifying. I could feel my mind unraveling. It was like I was caught in a trance, unable to look away from the thing that stood before us. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was hollow, empty, like a void waiting to consume anything it touched. And then it spoke. "You're already here. You always were." The voice was not a voice at all. It was the sound of the earth itself, ancient and distorted, twisting through the air and scraping against my skull. My knees went weak. I wanted to fall, to let the darkness take me, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. I couldn't breathe. Sarah was behind me, clutching my arm, but she was silent, frozen, just as I was. The creature, no, whatever it was, took another step, and this time, I felt it in my bones. A cold, deep, gnawing presence, as if it was inside me, dragging out the warmth from my chest. And then, it spoke again, this time louder, the words reverberating through the air like an ancient chant. "You are ours. You are always ours." The sound crashed into my mind, overwhelming me. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The darkness in front of me, the swirling void that seemed to stretch into infinity, was all that I could see. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed faintly, like dying stars, and I could feel them, piercing through me, pulling me toward it. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I blinked, disoriented. The clearing around us was empty again, the figure nowhere to be seen. The forest, however, felt wrong. More wrong than ever. The oppressive weight in the air was stronger now, suffocating us, choking us with its presence. I could hear Sarah breathing heavily behind me, but she didn't speak. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The fear was paralyzing, a palpable thing that wrapped itself around us, pressing us deeper into the nightmare we were trapped in. We turned to run again, but before we could take a step, the ground beneath us shifted. It wasn't just the trees now. The very earth was changing. The soil beneath our feet crumbled, the ground splitting open like some monstrous wound in the world. The trees, those twisted, gnarled trees, moved, their roots reaching up from the earth like claws, pulling us in, dragging us closer to the void that seemed to have no end. I could feel Sarah's hand slip from mine as we were pulled apart. The ground split open, the earth screaming, and I was falling into darkness. I reached out, desperate to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing. Just the pull of the earth, the cold, and the endless, empty void. And then, everything stopped. I don't know how long I lay there, motionless. I don't know how long I was lost in the dark, but when I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was somewhere else. Somewhere worse. The air was thick with the scent of decay. The ground beneath me was cold and damp, like stone, and all around me, there were voices. You are here now. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many. The whispers filled my head, and they were not from the creatures we had seen. No, these were something older, something deeper. They didn't speak in words, they sang, a low, constant hum that rattled my bones. I stood, my body moving despite my mind screaming for me to stay still, to stay hidden. But I couldn't. Something was forcing me to move. I was no longer in the forest. I wasn't even in the world I knew. I was in the place between places. And it wanted me to stay. I don't know how I got there. One moment I was on the forest floor, the ground splitting beneath me, and the next, I was standing in the cold, oppressive darkness. The air smelled of rot and decay, thick and suffocating, as though the very atmosphere was alive and feeding off the terror that filled me. Around me, the whispers grew louder. It wasn't a language, not anything I could understand. It was a chorus of voices, screams, moans, whispers, tangled together in a cacophony of dread. It felt like the very walls of reality were pressing in on me, folding in on themselves, shifting and twisting in ways that made no sense. I wanted to scream, to claw my way back to the world I knew, but something held me there, something far more powerful than fear. The ground beneath my feet was cold and slick, like stone, but not stone, like it was alive, pulsating, breathing. I dared not touch it, afraid of what would happen if I did. The shadows around me were deeper here, and I could feel them moving, slithering, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. Then I heard it, the sound of a door creaking open. I turned toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. There, ahead of me, was a dark doorway. The edges of it flickered with dim, sickly light, and I could feel it pulling me, beckoning me toward it. I didn't want to go. I didn't want to step closer to whatever it was, but I couldn't stop myself. My feet moved forward of their own accord, dragging me into the darkness. As I crossed the threshold, the temperature dropped even further. It was like I had stepped into a different world altogether, one where the rules of nature didn't apply. The darkness was suffocating, but I could see faint glimmers of movement, shadows shifting just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't see what they were, but I knew they were watching. Jake! Jake, are you here? The voice echoed in the darkness, familiar and haunting. It was Sarah's voice. I spun around, but there was nothing behind me but the void. The whispering continued, louder now, as though the shadows themselves were speaking to me. The air felt heavy, pressing down on my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. Sarah. I called, my voice trembling. Sarah, where are you? There was no answer, but I could hear her again. This time, the voice was closer, almost as if it was right next to me. Jake, help me. I started running, my feet moving on their own, the ground slipping beneath me as I ran deeper into the void. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the darkness itself was closing in around me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. I had to find her. I had to, I froze. In the distance, there was a figure. A tall, thin figure, standing motionless in the darkness. Its outline was faint, like it was barely there, flickering in and out of existence. It was one of them. But this one was different. It wasn't just tall and gaunt. Its face, it had no face, no features at all. It was a black void, the absence of light, like it was made of the very darkness itself. It stood there, motionless, watching me, waiting. Jake. The voice again, closer now. But this time, it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a low, guttural rasp. Come closer. We've been waiting for you. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I felt the urge to run, to escape, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. There was something magnetic about it, something that pulled me in, like it was reaching into my very soul. Suddenly, I felt something cold wrap around my ankle. I looked down in terror. Something, long, twisted, and pale, had slithered out of the shadows and coiled around my leg. It was like a rope made of bone and sinew, tightening with every passing second. I tried to pull away, but it only dragged me closer to the figure. The whispering grew louder now, the words forming into something I could almost understand. "You are ours." I could feel the ground beneath me shifting again, the stone-like surface twisting and contorting, as though it were alive. The darkness pressed in closer, suffocating me. My mind raced as I struggled to free myself from the grip of whatever had hold of me, but it was useless. The more I fought, the stronger it became. "Jake." The voice was right next to me now. It was no longer Sarah's voice. It was something else. Something ancient, filled with a hunger that I could feel in my very bones. The figure took a step toward me. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, floating through the air as if it wasn't bound by the laws of physics. The black void of its face seemed to shimmer, pulsing with something dark and hungry. "You are already here." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness filled my mouth, suffocating me. The cold wrapped around me like a shroud, drowning me in its grip. I could feel the creature's presence growing closer, feel the void inside it reaching for me. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't sure where I was. I wasn't in the darkness anymore. I wasn't anywhere at all. I was floating. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't do anything but feel. The sensation of weightlessness, of being suspended in an endless void, was overwhelming. It felt like I was caught between worlds, between life and death, between reality and the endless abyss. And I wasn't alone. All around me, I could hear the whispers. The voices. The others. I could feel their presence, like they were all around me, waiting for me to speak, to understand. But there was nothing to say. There was nothing I could do. I was trapped in this endless place, where nothing was real and yet everything was. I don't know how long I stayed there. Time didn't seem to exist in the way it should. But eventually, the whispers stopped. And then, I heard something else. A voice. One I knew all too well. "Jake, it's not over yet." I turned, but there was no one there. Not yet. I don't know how long I was suspended in that place. Time had lost all meaning, and the whispers, those eerie, unsettling voices, had become a constant hum in the back of my mind. It felt as though I was being slowly suffocated, my very existence being eroded piece by piece. And yet, even in the endless black, I couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that I wasn't alone. That whatever these things were, these ancient, dark forces, they were waiting for me to make a choice. I had been pulled into their world, into a place between worlds, where the rules of reality didn't apply. The darkness, the cold, the weight of the void, they had all become part of me, entwined in my very being. And still, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed, trapped in the never-ending, suffocating quiet. But then, it happened again. A voice. "Jake," it wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't any voice I knew. It was a deep, guttural whisper, filled with malice, a sound that twisted my soul with every syllable. The darkness around me seemed to pulse with the voice's rhythm, vibrating through the emptiness. I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't tell if it was calling me, beckoning me forward, or warning me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear myself free of this place and run, but the pull was too strong. It felt like something, someone, was guiding me, directing me toward an unseen destination. And for the first time since I arrived here, I felt a terrible compulsion to follow. The whispers intensified as I moved, the shadows seeming to part before me, and the void stretching endlessly in all directions. Then, ahead of me, I saw something, a light. It was faint, just a flicker, but it was there. It wasn't the blinding, suffocating darkness that had surrounded me. It was something else. I moved toward it, drawn by an invisible force. The air grew warmer the closer I got, the heavy weight of the darkness lifting just enough for me to feel some semblance of hope. As I neared the light, I saw that it was not just a light. It was a figure, standing in the middle of an open space. The figure was tall, shrouded in a robe of shadow, with a face that was both there and not there at the same time. The darkness seemed to twist around it, moving like smoke, but it wasn't suffocating. It was familiar. "Jake," the figure spoke, its voice like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. "You have reached the end." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, as if the very air had frozen. The voice was not the voice of one of the creatures, nor was it the voice of whatever force had dragged me into this place. It was something else. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me. "I don't understand," I said, my voice weak, barely a whisper. "Where am I? What do you want from me?" The figure's face seemed to shimmer, as if shifting in and out of existence. It didn't look directly at me, but its presence was all-encompassing, filling the void. "You were never meant to escape, Jake. You never were." The voice seemed to carry a weight of finality, a truth that rang in my bones. "No. No, I'm not staying here. I can't stay here." I yelled, my voice breaking as I fought against the unseen force that held me in place. I wasn't sure if it was the figure or the place itself, but I could feel the pressure building against my chest, forcing me to my knees. The figure didn't move. It didn't have to. The words were enough. "This place is where all things come to rest. You've been here before. You always come back." I shook my head in denial. "No. I'm not dead. I'm alive." I screamed, my voice trembling. "I just want to go back. I just want to see my friends, Sarah. I need to see her. Sarah is lost. She is part of this now. Part of the cycle." I didn't understand. "What cycle? What do you mean?" "You see, Jake. You were chosen long before you ever stepped into the woods. The forest is not just a place, it is a doorway. And you, along with your friends, have crossed that threshold too many times. Every time you run, you return. Every time you flee, you get closer to the truth." I was shaking now, my mind racing to make sense of what it was saying. "But I don't remember. I never wanted any of this." The figure finally turned its head, its face, or what was left of it, focused on me. "You were never meant to remember. Your memories have always been erased. You were always part of it. The creatures in the woods, they are part of the cycle, just as you are. And you will always return. Always." The weight of the words pressed down on me, and I felt a crushing wave of despair. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, this was no accident. This wasn't a random nightmare I could wake from. I was trapped here. The forest, the creatures, the darkness, it was all connected. It had been waiting for me. The figure's voice rumbled once more, the final words sealing my fate. "The choice is yours now, Jake. You can join us, and we will take you to your rightful place, where you will stay forever. Or, you can leave, and return to the cycle. But know this, you will never escape it. Not for long." I could feel the pull of the darkness, the weight of the choice pressing on me. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed. I didn't know what would happen if I left. But I had to make a decision. I could feel it in my bones now, the truth. This place, the darkness, the creatures, they weren't just hunting me. They were me. They were part of me. And if I chose to leave, to return, I would be part of the endless cycle forever. I closed my eyes. And I made my choice. I opened them again. The figure was gone. The darkness had lifted. The whispers stopped. And I was standing in the forest again. The trees were silent, the air still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew that I would never escape. Not for long. The cycle would continue. And I would always return. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear the thudding of footsteps, drawing closer. The hunt was on.